The sound of bone meeting flesh echoed through Madison Square Garden as George Foreman's massive fist crashed into the heavy bag, sending it swinging violently on its chain. Sweat poured down his face as he prepared for what everyone called a suicide mission. In 7 days he would face Muhammad Ali in Kinshasa, Zaire, a fight that would later be known as the Rumble in the Jungle. "George, that's enough for today," shouted his trainer Dick Sadler from across the gym. But Foreman wasn't listening. Something was bothering him about Ali's previous fights, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "I'm gonna crush him," Foreman muttered, delivering another devastating blow to the bag. At 25 years old, George Foreman was the most terrifying heavyweight in boxing history. 40 opponents had faced him. 37 had fallen before him, most knocked unconscious in brutal fashion. His last 2 title defenses had lasted a combined 4 minutes and 25 seconds. The reporters crowding around the edge of the ring exchanged nervous glances. One of them, Howard Cosell, stepped forward. "George, they're calling Ali the underdog by 3-to-1 odds. Does that surprise you?" Foreman paused mid-punch and turned toward Cosell, his eyes narrowing. "You know what surprises me? That anyone thinks he'll make it past the second round." He peeled off his gloves and tossed them to his assistant. "Ali talks, I destroy." As Foreman stormed off toward the locker room, Cosell turned to the camera. "There you have it. The champion seems absolutely certain of victory. But somewhere in Kinshasa, Muhammad Ali is training right now, and I suspect he has something that George Foreman hasn't seen yet." The camera never caught what happened next, a moment that would have changed everything. As Foreman pushed open the door to his dressing room, he found Don King, the fight's promoter, watching footage of Ali's previous fights on a small television. "What are you doing here?" Foreman demanded. King's famous hair stood at attention as he turned with a wide smile. "Just checking on my investment, champ. Making sure you're ready to give the world the show they're paying to see." Foreman grunted and moved to the shower, but his eyes lingered on the screen where Ali was dancing around Cleveland Williams in their 1966 bout. Something about Ali's hands caught his attention, a subtle movement before each combination that seemed almost deliberate. "Rewind that," Foreman commanded suddenly. King raised an eyebrow, but did as he was told. They watched the sequence again, Ali shifting his lead hand slightly before unleashing a lightning-fast combination. "I've never noticed that before," Foreman muttered. "Noticed what?" King asked, genuinely curious. But Foreman just shook his head and continued to the shower. That night, he called his trainer and demanded every piece of Ali footage they could find. Something wasn't right, and George Foreman was determined to figure it out before he stepped into the ring in Zaire. What he didn't know was that he was about to stumble upon a secret technique that would change boxing forever. A technique that Ali had hidden in plain sight for years. Across the world in Kinshasa, Muhammad Ali sat alone in his training camp, wrapping his hands with methodical precision. He flexed his fingers, testing the tension of the wraps, and smiled to himself. "Let's see if Big George can figure it out," he whispered to the empty room. "Probably not. They never do." The Congolese heat pressed down on George Foreman like a wet blanket as he paced in his dressing room beneath Stade du 20 Mai. Outside, 60,000 voices chanted in unison, "Ali, Beaumaye! Ali, Beaumaye! Ali, kill him!" Foreman's face remained impassive, but inside a storm was brewing. For 2 weeks he had obsessively studied Ali's fights, watching the same sequences over and over until his eyes burned. There was something there, a pattern in Ali's hand movements before his most devastating combinations. "You ready, champ?" Dick Sadler asked, breaking Foreman's concentration. Foreman nodded silently and held out his hands for the gloves. As Sadler worked, Foreman's mind raced through what he'd discovered in those late-night sessions. "I figured something out about Ali," Foreman said suddenly. Sadler looked up, surprised. "What's that?" "His hands. Before he throws those combinations, he does something with his lead hand. It's almost like he's giving a signal." Sadler frowned. "What kind of signal?" "I don't know exactly, but it's there. Watch for it tonight." Sadler seemed skeptical but nodded anyway. "Just focus on what we planned. Press him, cut off the ring, and punish him when he's on the ropes." The dressing room door swung open, and an official poked his head in. "5 minutes, Mr. Foreman." As Foreman made his way toward the ring, the hostile crowd's chanting grew louder. The scene was surreal, a sea of faces in the tropical night, all unified in their support for Ali and contempt for him. When Ali entered, the stadium erupted. He danced toward the ring, playing to the crowd, his face animated with confidence. Foreman watched him carefully, searching for any sign of fear. There was none. The referee called them to center ring for instructions. Ali was already talking. "You been watching my tapes, George?" Ali whispered, just loud enough for Foreman to hear over the crowd. "Did you see anything interesting?" Foreman's eyes widened slightly. How could Ali know? Ali winked and returned to his corner. The mind games had begun. When the bell rang, Foreman charged forward with bad intentions, throwing heavy punches designed to end the fight quickly. But Ali was ready. He slipped most of Foreman's punches with his legendary reflexes, occasionally landing sharp counters that seemed to come from nowhere. In the second round, Foreman cornered Ali against the ropes. As he prepared to unleash a barrage of punches, he saw it, the subtle tell he'd noticed in the footage. Ali's lead hand dropped slightly, rotating outward almost imperceptibly. Foreman hesitated for a fraction of a second, expecting the combination he'd seen on tape. That split-second delay was all Ali needed to slip away and counter with a sharp right hand that snapped Foreman's head back. "You looking for something, George?" Ali taunted as they separated. "You won't find it." By the fifth round, Foreman was beginning to tire. His punches, while still powerful, were coming slower. Ali, meanwhile, had settled into a strange strategy that confounded everyone watching. He was laying against the ropes, inviting Foreman's attack, a tactic later dubbed the rope-a-dope. As Foreman pounded away at Ali's arms and body, Ali would occasionally snake out sharp punches that landed with surprising force. Each time, Foreman noticed, came after that same subtle hand movement. Between rounds, Foreman collapsed onto his stool, breathing heavily. "He's playing with me," Foreman gasped to Sadler. "That thing with his hand, it's deliberate. He wants me to see it." Sadler looked confused. "What are you talking about, George? You're winning this fight. Just keep punching." But Foreman knew better. As the fight progressed, his arms grew heavier. Ali, meanwhile, seemed to be gaining strength. In the eighth round, Ali's lead hand made that familiar, subtle movement. Foreman, exhausted but still dangerous, braced for what he now recognized as Ali's signal for a right-hand counter. Instead, Ali unleashed a lightning-fast combination he hadn't shown all fight. A left hook followed by a straight right that caught Foreman completely off guard. Foreman's legs buckled. He tried to clinch, to hold on, but Ali pushed him away and delivered a final flurry of punches. Foreman's massive body crashed to the canvas as the stadium erupted. As the referee counted him out, Foreman's mind wasn't on the loss or the title. It was on that hand movement, Ali's secret signal that sometimes meant one thing and sometimes meant another. It wasn't just a tell. It was a masterful deception. 17 years would pass before Foreman would fully understand what he had glimpsed that night in Zaire. A technique so subtle yet so effective that it had helped Muhammad Ali defeat the most fearsome puncher in heavyweight history. But the seed had been planted, and as George Foreman slowly pushed himself to his feet, he knew that someday he would solve the mystery of Ali's hands. Atlantic City, 1991. The boardwalk hummed with anticipation as 42-year-old George Foreman prepared for another fight in his improbable comeback. 7 years after returning to the ring following a 10-year retirement, Foreman had transformed from the scowling destroyer of the 70s to a smiling, hamburger-loving preacher who connected with audiences everywhere. In his dressing room at Trump Plaza, Foreman sat quietly as his hands were wrapped. On a small television in the corner, a documentary about Muhammad Ali played. Foreman's eyes locked onto the screen as footage from the Rumble in the Jungle appeared. "Can you turn that up?" he asked his cutman. The volume increased and Foreman leaned forward as the narrator described Ali's revolutionary tactics. But Foreman wasn't listening to the commentary. He was watching Ali's hands. "Pause it there," Foreman suddenly exclaimed. The image froze on a close-up of Ali on the ropes, his gloves positioned defensively. "I knew it," Foreman whispered. His trainer, Angelo Dundee, who had once been in Ali's corner, looked over curiously. "Knew what, George?" Foreman pointed at the screen. "Look at his lead hand. The way the wrist is slightly turned. That's what I saw in Zaire. That's what I could never figure out." Dundee moved closer to the screen, squinting. "The hand position? It's more than that," Foreman said, excitement building in his voice. "It's a false tell. Ali would deliberately show that hand position sometimes before throwing a specific combination, and sometimes before doing something completely different. He was training his opponents to read a pattern that wasn't consistent. Dundee's eyes widened in recognition. You're right. I remember him practicing that. He called it his lighthouse. His what? His lighthouse. He said it was like a lighthouse beam. It draws your eye exactly where he wants it, making you miss what's coming from another direction. Foreman sat back, shaking his head in amazement. All these years, I thought he was just faster than me that night. But he was playing a chess game while I was playing checkers. A knock at the door interrupted them. 10 minutes, Mr. Foreman. As his gloves were laced up, Foreman continued to think about Ali's technique. He had been incorporating elements of it into his own fighting style during his comeback without fully understanding the principle behind it. Now, with clarity finally achieved, he felt a sense of completion. You know, Foreman said to Dundee as they prepared to walk to the ring, I'm going to use it tonight. Dundee raised an eyebrow. The lighthouse? Yeah, but my version. Foreman smiled. Let's see if it works as well for me as it did for Ali. That night, against a younger, faster opponent, George Foreman employed his adaptation of Ali's technique. He created his own false tell, a slight dip of his right shoulder that sometimes preceded a jab and sometimes was just a feint. His opponent, trained to react to conventional patterns, found himself consistently out of position. In the 7th round, Foreman set the trap perfectly. He showed the shoulder dip, his opponent adjusted for the expected jab, and Foreman instead unleashed a devastating right hand that ended the fight. In his post-fight interview, when asked about his strategy, Foreman just smiled. I learned from the best, he said cryptically. Sometimes the biggest secrets in boxing are hidden right in front of your eyes. Back in his dressing room, Foreman received a phone call. His face lit up when he heard the voice on the other end. You saw it, didn't you? Muhammad Ali's voice, slowed by Parkinson's disease but still unmistakable, came through the receiver. I did, Foreman replied. Took me long enough. 17 years, Ali said with a chuckle. Better late than never. Why didn't you ever tell anyone about it? Foreman asked. That technique could have been your legacy in boxing schools everywhere. There was a pause before Ali answered. Some things aren't meant to be taught, George. They're meant to be discovered. After hanging up, Foreman sat alone contemplating Ali's words. The secret hand technique, the lighthouse as Ali had called it, wasn't just a tactical advantage. It was a philosophy about boxing itself, the art of showing your opponent exactly what you want them to see, while preparing something else entirely. Foreman decided then that he would perfect this technique and eventually pass it on to a new generation of fighters. But first he had unfinished business, becoming the oldest heavyweight champion in history. Las Vegas, 1994. The MGM Grand Garden Arena buzzed with anticipation as 45-year-old George Foreman prepared to challenge 26-year-old Michael Moorer for the heavyweight championship of the world. If successful, Foreman would break a record that had stood for nearly a century. In his dressing room, Foreman sat calmly as HBO's cameras documented what many believed would be his final title shot. On his request, the television played footage of Ali's fights, not just the rumble in the jungle, but lesser-known bouts where Ali's lighthouse technique was most evident. You still studying Ali after all these years? Asked his brother Roy, who served as one of his cornermen. Foreman nodded. I'm not just studying him, I'm honoring him. The truth was, Foreman had spent the 3 years since his epiphany perfecting his version of Ali's technique. He had developed not one but several false tells that he could deploy strategically throughout a fight. Against Moorer, a technically brilliant but inexperienced champion, Foreman planned to use them all. As he made his way to the ring, Foreman appeared serene. The hostile crowd that had once chanted for his demise in Zaire had been replaced by supportive fans who saw in him a symbol of perseverance and redemption. When the bell rang, Moorer immediately established control with his jab, keeping Foreman at bay and picking him apart from the outside. By the 5th round, Foreman's face was swelling, and ringside commentators were suggesting his corner should consider stopping the fight. But Foreman wasn't concerned. He was setting traps, showing Moorer patterns and tells, preparing for the moment when he would spring his surprise. Between rounds, HBO's microphones caught Foreman's conversation with his trainer. He's reading my shoulder movement now, Foreman said calmly. He thinks he knows what's coming next. You need to pick up the pace, George, his trainer urged. You're down on all the scorecards. Foreman just smiled. Don't worry. He'll be looking at the lighthouse when the ship hits him. As the middle rounds progressed, Foreman continued to show the same tell, a slight dip of his right shoulder before throwing a labored jab. Moorer had adjusted, easily slipping the telegraphed punch each time. In the 10th round, with Foreman clearly behind on points the moment finally came, Foreman showed the familiar shoulder dip, but instead of the expected jab, he delivered a perfectly timed straight right hand that caught Moorer flush on the chin. The champion collapsed to the canvas, unable to beat the count. George Foreman, at 45 years old, had become the oldest heavyweight champion in history. In his dressing room after the fight, Foreman received another call from Ali. Despite his condition having worsened, Ali's joy was unmistakable. "You used the lighthouse," Ali said slowly. "I did," Foreman confirmed. "But I put my own spin on it. You taught me well, champ. Now you must teach others," Ali insisted. Foreman promised he would. In the years that followed, Foreman established a boxing academy in Houston where he began sharing the technique with select fighters. He called it the Ali Principle, the strategic use of false tells to manipulate an opponent's expectations. One afternoon in 2001, a documentary crew from HBO arrived at Foreman's gym to film a special on the Rumble in the Jungle for its 27th anniversary. After the formal interview with cameras off, the director asked Foreman a question. "There's a rumor that you and Ali shared a secret technique that was never fully explained to the public. Is there any truth to that?" Foreman smiled. "Boxing is full of secrets. Some are meant to stay that way." But later that day, with just the crew's sound technician present as they removed his microphone, Foreman whispered, "Look at Ali's left hand in the 3rd round against Foreman and the 5th round against Frazier in Manila. Same movement, different outcome. That's where the secret lies." The sound technician, a boxing fan himself, went home that night and pulled up the footage. What he saw changed his understanding of boxing forever. A subtle rotation of Ali's wrist that occurred just before his most devastating combinations. It wasn't just a nervous tic or a defensive adjustment. It was a masterful psychological weapon. Word began to spread through boxing circles about the lighthouse technique. Young fighters started incorporating elements of it into their styles, often without fully understanding its principles. Veterans recognized it immediately when they saw it, wondering how they had missed it all these years. In 2016, at Muhammad Ali's funeral, George Foreman stood among the pallbearers, tears streaming down his face, as he helped carry his former rival to his final resting place. Reporters asked him about his remarkable transformation from Ali's bitter enemy to one of his closest friends. "He taught me more than boxing," Foreman said simply. "He taught me how to see." That evening, Foreman visited Ali's widow, Lonnie, presenting her with a small box. "Muhammad wanted you to have this," Lonnie said, opening it to reveal a pair of hand wraps, yellowed with age. "Are these?" Foreman began. "From Zaire," Lonnie confirmed. "He saved them all these years. Said someday you'd understand their true value." Foreman held the wraps reverently, noticing for the first time small markings on the fabric, dots positioned strategically where Ali's wrist would flex. "The lighthouse guides," Foreman whispered, finally understanding the full extent of Ali's genius. Today, in elite boxing gyms around the world, the Ali lighthouse is taught as fundamental to the psychological dimension of boxing. What began as a secret technique discovered by a defeated champion 17 years after his greatest loss has become part of boxing's essential curriculum. And whenever a fighter uses the technique effectively, showing one thing while delivering another, old-timers at ringside nod knowingly and whisper, "There it is. The lighthouse is guiding him home." George Foreman, now in his 70s, still occasionally visits young fighters in Houston. He doesn't say much, but sometimes he'll stand behind a heavy bag, point to a specific spot and say simply, "Make them look here, but hit them there. That's what Muhammad taught me." And in that simple instruction lies the genius of Ali's secret hand technique, a deception so subtle, so effective, that it took his greatest rival 17 years to fully comprehend it. A technique that changed boxing forever by reminding us that the greatest victories often come not from what we show, but from what we hide in plain sight.